There is a particular kind of morning that changes how you think about something. You assumed you already understood. For us, it happened on a Tuesday in May of 2025. Boni, our 7-year-old Labrador Retriever, walked to the top of the 2 backyard steps. He has navigated every morning of his life, and stopped. Not dramatically, not in obvious pain. He simply stood there for 4, maybe 5 seconds. His weight shifted slightly back, before committing to the first step down. It lasted less than 10 seconds total. By the time he reached the grass, he was moving normally, tail up, nose. Already at work on whatever the overnight hours had left in the yard. We almost missed it. We would have missed it, actually, if we had not happened to be filming that morning for an unrelated reason. Watching the footage back later that day, slowed down. The hesitation was unmistakable, and once you have seen something like that, you cannot unsee it. Boni is a 76-pound male Labrador, healthy by every standard measure. Current on all veterinary care, good weight, good coat, good appetite, and no diagnosed conditions. He is also a breed with a well-documented relationship with joint disease. The Orthopedic Foundation for Animals, which maintains the largest open registry of canine hip and elbow evaluations in the United States, reports that approximately 13% of Labrador Retrievers evaluated through their program receive a dysplastic rating, and that figure reflects only screened dogs from health-conscious breeders. General population prevalence is understood to be higher. Boni had received a fair hip rating at his 2-year evaluation, which is within the passing range but toward the lower end of it. We knew, going in, that his hips were something to watch. What we did not have, until that Tuesday morning, footage, was a specific reason to act. This video is the account of what we did next. It is not a protocol that we are recommending you replicate exactly. It is not a scientific study. It is not a verdict on raw feeding versus commercial diets. And we are not going to tell you that what worked, or appeared to work, for Boni will work for your dog. What it is an honest, detailed account of a decision-making process. What questions we asked, what our veterinarian said, what the research we found actually showed, and where it fell short, what we tried, what we adjusted, and what we observed over the following months. We are going to be specific about the science we used to make decisions, and equally specific about where that science is preliminary, contested, or simply not as strong as some sources would have you believe. We have no supplements to sell. We have no brand relationships relevant to this content. We have a dog we love, footage of a 4-second hesitation that we could not stop thinking about, and 8 months of notes. That is what this video is made of. One important framing note before we begin. Everything in this protocol was developed and monitored in collaboration with our veterinarian. We are going to refer to her throughout this video simply as our vet, because she has not consented to be named in a public video, and we respect that boundary. She is a licensed veterinarian in California, with additional training in integrative medicine. She reviewed every element of this protocol before we implemented it, adjusted several things we had initially planned, flagged 2 ingredients that required modification, and has been monitoring Boni with regular check-ins throughout. Her involvement is not a disclaimer. It is the actual foundation of everything we did. If you take one thing from this entire video, before you watch another minute of it, let it be this. Do not implement a significant dietary change for your dog without veterinary involvement, not because we say so, because the consequences of getting the nutritional balance wrong in a homemade diet are real, documented, and sometimes serious. We will come back to that in detail. With that said, let us start at the beginning. The morning after we reviewed the footage, we called our vet. We described what we had seen, sent her the video clip, and asked for her honest assessment of whether this was something to address now or monitor. Her answer was careful and, in retrospect, exactly the right way to begin this process. She said that what we were seeing was consistent with the early signs of hip discomfort in a breed predisposed to it, that it did not constitute an emergency, and that the most useful next step was a proper orthopedic evaluation to establish a baseline, because without a baseline, we would have no objective way to measure whether anything we did subsequently made any difference. That framing, the insistence on a measurable baseline, before any intervention, turned out to be one of the most important things she said throughout this entire process. We want to hold onto it as a principle because it is one that a lot of dog health content, including content we had previously found compelling, tends to skip entirely. We scheduled the orthopedic evaluation for the following week. In the meantime, we started reading. What we were trying to understand first was not what to feed Boni. It was what was actually happening in his joints because, upon reviewing that footage, we realized we had been operating on a vague, intuitive understanding of joint health rather than a specific one. We knew that labs got hip dysplasia. We knew glucosamine supplements existed. We knew that older dogs sometimes got stiff. That was essentially the extent of our working knowledge. So we started with the anatomy. The hip joint in a Labrador is a ball and socket structure, the rounded head of the femur sitting in the acetabulum of the pelvis, the whole articulation, surrounded by a joint capsule and bathed in synovial fluid, with the bearing surfaces of the joint covered in hyaline cartilage. In a healthy joint, the cartilage is smooth, wool-hydrated, and resilient, capable of absorbing and distributing the compressive forces of normal movement. In a joint compromised by dysplasia or early osteoarthritis, the fit between the ball and socket is imperfect. The cartilage experiences uneven load distribution, and over time, that uneven loading, combined with the inflammatory response it triggers, begins to degrade the cartilage surface. The degradation is slow, largely invisible from the outside, and by the time it produces obvious clinical signs, it has typically been progressing for a significant period. This much is not contested. This is straightforward veterinary anatomy and pathology that you can find in any standard veterinary textbook. And it was the first genuinely useful thing we learned, because it clarified something important. The hesitation on the steps was not the problem. It was a signal that something had been developing for a while that we had not been tracking closely enough. The orthopedic evaluation confirmed this. Boni's assessment, conducted by our vet using a standardized examination protocol including gait observation, manual joint palpation, and range of motion measurement on both hips using a goniometer, a hinged instrument that measures joint angles in degrees, showed reduced extension range in his right hip compared to his left, and compared to the reference ranges for his breed and age. His left hip showed mild reduction as well. She described both hips as showing early degenerative changes consistent with his fair OFA rating and his age, and said that his current level of discomfort appeared mild but warranted attention. She also said something that shifted our thinking considerably. She told us that the question of whether dietary intervention could meaningfully influence the progression of early joint disease in dogs was genuinely open, that there was some legitimate research suggesting certain nutritional components had anti-inflammatory or structural support properties relevant to joint tissue. and that she was not opposed to us exploring this carefully, but that she had two conditions. First, any protocol had to be reviewed by her before implementation. Second, we had to commit to regular re-evaluation, so that we would know whether what we were doing was helping, doing nothing, or potentially causing other problems. We agreed to both conditions. They are the reason this account has any integrity at all. Before we go further, we want to be honest about something regarding the research landscape. We entered at this point because it matters for how you evaluate everything that follows. The scientific literature on nutritional interventions for canine joint disease is real but uneven. There are legitimate peer-reviewed studies on certain compounds, omega-3 fatty acids, in particular, that have a reasonably strong evidence base in dogs, and green-lipped mussel extract has been studied in controlled trials with meaningful results. But the literature is also full of studies with small sample sizes, short durations, industry funding, and outcome measures that are harder to standardize than they appear. Curcumin, for example, which we will discuss in detail in the next chapter, has been studied extensively in laboratory models and in humans. But the canine-specific clinical evidence is considerably thinner than most raw feeding content would lead you to believe. We are telling you this not to undermine the decisions we made, but because we think you deserve to know the actual strength of the evidence behind each component of what we tried, rather than a version that presents everything as equally and definitively proven. Some of what we did was supported by reasonably good evidence. Some of it was supported by plausible biological reasoning and limited preliminary research. We will tell you which is which as we go. What we decided, after the orthopedic evaluation and a long conversation with our vet, was to make 3 specific changes to Boni's diet. Each one chosen for a specific reason, each one with a defined rationale and a defined risk profile that we had reviewed with her. We did not overhaul his entire diet overnight. We did not switch immediately to a fully raw protocol. We made targeted additions to his existing diet first, then transitioned more gradually as we monitored his response and his blood work. That graduated approach was our vet's recommendation, and it was the right one. The 3 initial additions were a marine-sourced omega-3 supplement in the form of wild sardines added to his meals, a green-lipped mussel supplement sourced from a reputable supplier, and a low-temperature prepared bone broth used as a food topper for moisture and palatability. The rationale for each of these, the research behind them, and the specific concerns our vet raised about each one will be covered in the chapters that follow. What we want to close this chapter with is the baseline data, because without it, nothing else in this account means anything. At the time of his initial evaluation in late May 2025, Boni's right hip extension, measured at a reduced range that our vet noted in his file alongside her clinical observations. His left hip showed a smaller but present reduction. His gait observation showed the pattern visible in our footage, the slight rear asymmetry, and the hesitation on inclines. His weight was 78.8 pounds, which our vet considered 2 to 3 pounds above his ideal. A modest but relevant factor given that every additional pound of body weight meaningfully increases the load on compromised hip joints. She recommended we address the weight alongside the dietary additions, not instead of them. That is the starting point. That is what we were actually working with. Everything that follows is measured against that. Our vet gave us a framework for evaluating any ingredient we were considering adding to Boni's diet. She called it, informally, the 3-question test. First, is there peer-reviewed evidence in dogs specifically, not just in laboratory models or humans, that this compound does what its proponents claim? Second, what are the known risks, contraindications, and drug interactions for this compound in dogs? Third, does the form and preparation we are planning actually deliver the compound in a biologically meaningful way, or are we paying for something that passes through without effect? We are going to apply that framework to each of the 3 additions we made, in the order we made them, and we are going to be honest about where each one scored well and where it did not. Addition 1. Marine omega-3 fatty acids, sardines. This was the addition our vet was most straightforwardly supportive of, and it has the strongest evidence base of anything we used. The research on omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA eicosapentaenoic acid and DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, in dogs with joint disease is more robust than most other nutritional interventions in this space. The most frequently cited study in this area is work by Rausch and colleagues published in the Journal of the American Veterinary Medical Association in 2010, which examined dogs with osteoarthritis receiving high-dose fish oil supplementation versus a control diet. Using force plate analysis, an objective laboratory measurement of how much weight a dog willingly bears on a painful limb. The study found statistically significant improvements in the fish oil group over 6 months. This is not a perfect study, and it is not the only relevant one. But it represents the kind of controlled, peer-reviewed, canine-specific evidence that gives our vet the confidence to recommend this category of supplementation without significant reservation. The mechanism is reasonably well understood. EPA and DHA are precursors to signaling molecules called resolvins and protectins that modulate the inflammatory response, essentially helping the body resolve inflammation more efficiently rather than simply suppressing it the way anti-inflammatory drugs do. In the context of joint disease, where chronic low-grade inflammation is a primary driver of cartilage degradation, this matters. Our vet's question 3, the delivery question, was where this got more specific. She was not enthusiastic about fish oil capsules, primarily because fish oil oxidizes relatively quickly once a capsule is opened, or a bottle is in use, and rancid fish oil is not only ineffective but potentially pro-inflammatory, the opposite of what we wanted. Her preference was whole food marine sources where the fat is still embedded in the natural cellular structure of the fish, which provides some protection against oxidation. She suggested wild-caught sardines packed in water, not in oil or brine, as a practical whole food source of EPA and DHA. The USDA nutritional database confirms that wild sardines provide approximately 1.4 to 1.8 grams of combined EPA and DHA per 100 grams, depending on species and season. For Boni's weight, our vet calculated a target omega-3 dose and worked backward to a serving size of approximately 30 to 40 grams of sardine meat 3 times per week. This is not a formula we invented. It came directly from her calculation based on his weight and the dosing parameters referenced in veterinary nutrition literature. The risks she flagged for omega-3 supplementation at meaningful doses were 2. First, omega-3 fatty acids have a mild antiplatelet effect, meaning they can affect blood clotting. This is not a concern at normal dietary levels, but it becomes relevant if a dog is scheduled for surgery or is on medications that also affect clotting. She noted it as something to disclose to any vet treating Boni in the future. Second, high-dose omega-3 supplementation can occasionally cause loose stools in dogs, particularly during the initial introduction period. She recommended introducing sardines gradually over 2 weeks rather than immediately at the full target dose. We did this, and Boni tolerated the transition without digestive issues. Addition 2. Green-lipped mussel. This one is more nuanced, and our vet's assessment of it was more qualified. Green-lipped mussel, Perna canaliculus, native to New Zealand, has been studied in dogs with osteoarthritis, and the results are genuinely interesting. The extract contains a combination of glycosaminoglycans, omega-3 fatty acids, including a specific form called icosahexatetranoic acid that is relatively rare in other food sources, and several other bioactive compounds. A study by Beerer and Bui, published in a veterinary therapeutic journal in the mid-2000s, examined green-lipped mussel extract in dogs with naturally occurring osteoarthritis and found significant improvements in pain and locomotion scores compared to a control group. This research is real and has been cited consistently in the veterinary literature on joint supplementation. Our vet's qualified support came from her question 2, the risk question, and her question 3, the delivery question, both of which had some complexity here. On the risk side, she had no significant safety concerns with green-lipped mussel for a healthy dog like Boni. Her qualification was about sourcing and form. The research supporting green-lipped mussel has been conducted primarily on freeze-dried whole mussel powder, not on fresh raw mussel meat served at home. The bioactive profile of fresh raw mussel is different from that of freeze-dried powder, and the research results from one form cannot be straightforwardly assumed to apply to the other. She also raised the point that fresh raw shellfish carries a genuine bacterial contamination risk, specifically Vibrio and Listeria, that freeze-dried products do not. This is where we want to be direct with you, because some raw feeding content makes fresh raw shellfish sound straightforwardly superior to processed supplements. And the situation is actually more complicated than that. After this conversation, we made a decision that differed from our original plan. Rather than using fresh raw green-lipped mussel meat as we had initially intended, we used a high-quality freeze-dried whole green-lipped mussel powder from a New Zealand supplier whose product had been third-party tested for heavy metals and bacterial contamination. Our vet reviewed the product specifications and approved it. The dose was calibrated to Boni's weight, according to the manufacturer's guidelines, which were themselves referenced to the veterinary literature dosing parameters. We want to be transparent about this change because it represents exactly the kind of adjustment that veterinary involvement produces. Our original plan, based on raw feeding literature we had read, was to use fresh mussel meat. Our vet's input changed that plan for a specific, well-reasoned safety rationale. That is not a failure of the protocol. That is the protocol working as it should. Addition 3. Bone broth as a food topper. This is the addition where the gap between the claims made in raw feeding communities and the actual strength of the evidence is widest. And we want to be straightforward about that. Bone broth is frequently presented in raw feeding content as a potent source of bioavailable collagen that directly rebuilds joint tissue. The reality is more complicated. When collagen is consumed orally, it is broken down by digestive enzymes into amino acids and peptides before absorption. And whether those peptides reach joint tissue in a form that meaningfully supports cartilage is an active area of research rather than a fact. There is some interesting preliminary research in humans, and some plausible biological reasoning. But the canine-specific controlled evidence for bone broth as a joint therapeutic is, at present, thin. Our vet's assessment of bone broth was straightforward. She did not think it was likely to harm Boni. She did not think the joint rebuilding claims were as strongly supported as some sources suggest. She did think it was a reasonable addition as a high-moisture, palatable food topper that would increase his overall fluid intake. which has genuine relevance to joint health because synovial fluid production depends on adequate hydration, and labs are not always enthusiastic drinkers. She had one specific warning that we think is important to share broadly. Bone broth prepared from bones is relatively high in phosphorus. For a dog with healthy kidneys, this is not a problem. For a dog with kidney disease or reduced kidney function, elevated dietary phosphorus is a genuine concern. This is a contraindication that almost none of the bone broth content we had previously encountered mentioned, and it is a real one. If your dog has any history of kidney issues or is older and has not had recent blood work, this is a conversation to have with your vet before adding bone broth regularly to their diet. For Boni, whose blood work confirmed healthy kidney function, our vet approved bone broth as a daily food topper. We prepared it at home using a low-temperature, long simmer method specifically because we wanted to avoid excessive sodium, which commercial bone broth products often contain in amounts inappropriate for dogs. The preparation involved grass-fed beef knuckle bones, filtered water, and a small amount of apple cider vinegar to help draw minerals from the bone. Simmered at a low temperature for 18 hours, and then strained and refrigerated. We did not add any seasoning, onion, garlic, or other ingredients, all of which are inappropriate for dogs. The finished broth was used at approximately 60 milliliters per meal as a topper over Boni's existing food. That was the extent of its role in the protocol. We are not going to tell you it rebuilt his cartilage, because we do not have evidence that it did. We can tell you that he found it highly palatable and that his water intake appeared to increase modestly in the weeks after we introduced it. Our original research list before the veterinary consultation included turmeric and curcumin as a planned addition. We want to explain why we ultimately did not include it in the protocol, because the reasoning is instructive. When we brought turmeric to our vet, her assessment on question 2, the risk question, was more cautious than we expected. Curcumin has a mild antiplatelet effect, similar to the omega-3s, but through a different pathway, which, compounded with the sardine addition, created a stacking concern she wanted to avoid. More significantly, curcumin is metabolized by the same liver enzyme system, specifically the cytochrome P450 pathway, that processes many common veterinary medications. For a dog on no current medications, this is a lower concern. But she preferred to keep the protocol simpler and add fewer variables, particularly given that the canine-specific evidence for curcumin is weaker than for the other two additions. We deferred to her judgment. This is not a conclusion about whether turmeric has merit in canine joint health. It is a specific decision made for a specific dog by a veterinarian who knew its complete health picture. Your vet may reach a different conclusion for your dog, and that is exactly as it should be. What we also did not do, and this is important, is immediately transition Boni to a fully raw diet. We added these 3 targeted components to his existing premium commercial diet rather than replacing it. Our vet's concern about homemade or raw diets as a complete replacement was grounded in a specific and well-documented problem. Research published in the Journal of the American Veterinary Medical Association has consistently found that a significant majority of home-prepared dog diets, even those following published recipes, fail to meet established nutritional standards for at least one essential nutrient. Getting the calcium to phosphorus ratio wrong alone can have meaningful skeletal consequences. Without formulation by a board-certified veterinary nutritionist, the risk of inadvertent nutritional deficiency in a complete homemade diet is real. We may revisit a more comprehensive dietary transition in the future, with proper formulation support. For this protocol, in this period, the targeted addition approach was the right level of intervention for where we were in the process. In Chapter 3, we move from the design of the protocol to its implementation and to the first objective data points that gave us reason to continue. The experience of implementing a new dietary protocol for a dog is less cinematic than most health content makes it appear. There is no montage. There is a lot of reading labels, second-guessing sourcing decisions, and standing in the kitchen wondering whether you are doing this correctly. We want to describe what the first 8 weeks actually looked like. Because the practical reality of execution is where most well-intentioned protocols quietly fall apart. We began in the first week of June 2025, approximately 10 days after Boni's baseline orthopedic evaluation. The first addition was the sardines, introduced gradually as our vet had recommended. Week 1 was a single small sardine, approximately 15 grams, mixed into his regular meal 3 times that week. We watched for digestive changes, loose stools in particular, and saw none. Week 2, we moved to the target serving of 30 to 35 grams, 3 times per week. He accepted it without hesitation, which anyone who has owned a Labrador will find entirely unsurprising. The sardines we used were wild-caught Pacific sardines in water, no added salt, sourced from a brand whose ingredient list contained exactly 1 item. We want to be specific about this because the sardine products available in most grocery stores vary considerably. Many are packed in oil, which adds unnecessary fat calories and, depending on the oil quality, potential oxidative load. Many are packed in brine, which means elevated sodium, inappropriate for regular dog feeding. Some contain added flavorings. The version we used had none of these. It costs no more than a standard can of sardines. The ingredient sourcing part of this protocol was genuinely simple. The green-lipped mussel powder was introduced in week 2, after the sardines were established, and we had confirmed no digestive sensitivity. We mixed the powder into his meal at the dose our vet had calculated, which, for his weight, came to approximately 450 to 500 milligrams per day. This is within the range referenced in the veterinary literature that informed the Beerer and Bowie research on green-lipped mussel in dogs. The powder dissolved readily into his food, and he showed no awareness of its presence. The bone broth topper came in week 3. We had prepared the first batch the weekend before, using the protocol described in the previous chapter, and refrigerated it in glass containers. The gelled consistency of the finished broth, which is the physical evidence of adequate gelatin content, was confirmed before we used it. We warmed approximately 60 milliliters to just above room temperature before adding it to his meal. Partly for palatability and partly because cold food from the refrigerator can cause mild gastric discomfort in some dogs. By week 4, all 3 additions were in place, and Boni was receiving them consistently. His regular meals remained his established premium commercial kibble. The additions were exactly that, additions, not replacements. What we observed during these first 4 weeks was, honestly, nothing dramatic. His appetite was unchanged, which for a Labrador means he ate everything placed in front of him with uniform enthusiasm, regardless of what it contained. His coat condition, which had already been good, appeared marginally improved in gloss by week 6, which our vet noted as consistent with increased omega-3 intake, but cautioned us not to overinterpret as a joint health signal. His stools remained normal throughout. The one change we noticed, and we want to be careful about how we describe it. Because we are aware of the very real possibility of observer bias when you are watching something you hope will work, was that the footage from our Week 6 biweekly gait recording appeared to show slightly reduced hesitation on the backyard steps in the morning. Not eliminated, reduced. The 4 to 5 second pause had shortened to what looked like 1 to 2 seconds on most mornings, with occasional mornings that looked essentially normal. We brought this observation to our vet at our Week 8 check-in. She conducted a repeat gait assessment and palpation, and noted what she described as a modest subjective improvement in his right hip comfort response during palpation compared to baseline. She was appropriately cautious about the significance of this finding, noting that palpation assessment carries inherent subjectivity and that a single 8-week data point was insufficient to conclude. What she recommended was continuing the protocol unchanged and scheduling a more comprehensive objective reassessment at the 12-week mark. She also checked his weight. He had lost 1.4 pounds over the 8 weeks, from 78.8 to 77.4 pounds. This was not a dramatic change, but our vet considered it a meaningful one in the joint health context. She reminded us of something worth repeating here. In dogs with hip joint disease, body weight management is one of the most consistently supported interventions in the veterinary literature. A 2006 study published in the Journal of Veterinary Internal Medicine by Pellizzeri and colleagues found that weight reduction alone in overweight dogs with hip osteoarthritis produced significant improvements in force plate measurements, independent of any other treatment. The weight loss we were seeing in Boni was almost certainly attributable to the lower caloric density of his modified meals rather than any active intervention on our part. But our vet considered it a beneficial secondary effect worth tracking. We continued the protocol. Weeks 9 through 12 were uneventful in the best possible sense. The additions were established, the routine was consistent, and we were accumulating footage and written observations without dramatic events in either direction. We noted that Boni was initiating play in the backyard slightly more frequently than in the weeks before we began. But we held this observation loosely because play initiation in dogs is influenced by many variables, including energy level, weather, our own availability and mood, the presence of interesting scents, and attributing it specifically to the dietary protocol would be overreaching. What we were trying to practice throughout this period was something that our vet had named explicitly at the beginning of this process, and that we found genuinely difficult in practice. She called it disciplined observation, the ability to notice and record what you actually see rather than what you are hoping to see. It sounds straightforward. It is not. When you love an animal, and you have invested time and thought and care into trying to help them, the pull toward interpreting ambiguous signals as positive is strong. The footage, the written notes, and the scheduled veterinary assessments were our structural protection against that pull. We would encourage anyone attempting a similar protocol with their own dog to build the same structures into their process. Not because you cannot trust yourself, but because the combination of emotional investment and the inherently subjective nature of observing an animal's comfort and movement makes unstructured observation an unreliable tool for evaluating whether something is working. The 12-week assessment is where we got our first genuinely objective data. We want to preface this chapter with something that feels important to say plainly. The 12-week assessment produced results that were encouraging. We are going to describe those results specifically. We are also going to be careful about what conclusions we draw from them. Because the honest answer to the question of whether the dietary protocol caused the improvements we observed is we cannot know for certain. This was not a controlled experiment. Boni was not part of a randomized trial. He received multiple simultaneous interventions, including dietary additions, modest weight loss, and continued regular moderate exercise. Any or all of these factors may have contributed to what we observed. We are not in a position to isolate the variable. We say this not to undermine the findings, but because we think you deserve an account that is honest about its own limitations. The 12-week assessment took place in early September 2025. Our vet conducted the same standardized protocol as the baseline evaluation: gait observation on a measured surface, manual palpation and pain response, assessment, and range of motion measurement on both hips using the goniometer. The goniometer measurements showed improvement in both hips compared to baseline. His right hip, which had shown the greater reduction at baseline, showed a measurable increase in extension range. His left hip showed a smaller but present improvement. Our vet documented these measurements in his clinical record. We are not going to publish the specific degree values here, because we do not want to imply a precision or clinical significance that our vet did not explicitly endorse. What she said, in her words, was that the measurements showed a meaningful improvement that she would not have expected from time alone, and that she considered consistent with a positive response to the intervention, while noting that she could not rule out natural variation or the effect of weight loss as contributing factors. His pain response during palpation was reduced compared to baseline on the right hip. His gait observation showed the pattern that our footage had suggested over the preceding weeks: reduced asymmetry, and a notably diminished hesitation on inclines. His weight was 77.1 pounds, down 1.7 pounds from baseline. His bloodwork, which we had requested specifically to monitor for any adverse effects of the protocol, was entirely within normal ranges across all markers, including liver function, kidney function, and a complete blood count. Our vet noted that the liver and kidney values were particularly relevant, given the omega-3 supplementation and the bone broth addition, and that their normality was reassuring. She recommended continuing the protocol unchanged for a further 12 weeks, with a repeat assessment at the 6-month mark from baseline. We want to spend a moment on something that the 12-week results did not show, because it is as informative as what they did show. The improvements were real, but they were modest. Boni was not transformed. He was not moving the way he had at 3 years old. The hesitation on the steps was reduced, not eliminated. On cold mornings, particularly after a period of rest, he still showed stiffness in his rear quarters that was not present in his middle years. His OFA rating had not changed because OFA ratings reflect structural anatomy that no dietary intervention is going to alter. What appeared to have changed was the symptomatic expression of his existing joint disease. The day-to-day functional experience of living in joints that have the structural characteristics they have. That distinction matters enormously. Joint disease has two components: the underlying structural reality, the anatomy of the joint, the degree of cartilage loss, the shape of the bones, and the functional experience, the inflammation. The synovial fluid quality, the muscular compensation, and the pain response. Dietary and lifestyle interventions can plausibly influence the second category. They do not alter the first. Anyone presenting a nutritional protocol as a solution to joint disease, rather than a management tool for its symptomatic expression, is overstating what the evidence supports. Our vet made this point clearly at the 12-week visit, and we considered it important enough to build it into this chapter rather than relegate it to a disclaimer. What we had, at 12 weeks, was reasonable evidence that the protocol was doing something positive, within the bounds of what it could plausibly do, that it was doing nothing harmful, and that it was worth continuing. We continued. The period between the 12-week and the 6-month assessments was when the protocol became genuinely routine rather than an active experiment. The sardines, the mussel powder, the bone broth, these became simply part of Boni's feeding process, no more remarkable than filling his water bowl. We continued our bi-weekly gait recordings and our written observations. We did not adjust the protocol during this period because our vet had recommended consistency as the priority. The 6-month assessment, conducted in late November 2025, showed continued maintenance of the improvements from 12 weeks rather than further dramatic change. His range of motion measurements were stable. His pain response during palpation was consistent with the 12-week findings. His weight had stabilized at 76.2 pounds, a total reduction of 2.6 pounds from baseline, which our vet considered ideal and recommended maintaining. She described his overall joint status at 6 months as well-managed early degenerative joint disease, stable on current protocol. That is a careful, qualified, clinically honest description, and we prefer it to anything more dramatic. His bloodwork remained normal across all parameters. The one additional finding at 6 months that we had not anticipated was a comment from our vet about his dental health. The green-lipped mussel powder she had initially approved with some qualification had turned out to be genuinely well tolerated. And she noted that she was seeing increasing interest from other veterinary colleagues in freeze-dried whole mussel preparations as a joint supplement option, reflecting a gradual shift in how some integrative-leaning veterinarians were thinking about this category. She was not ready to call it a consensus recommendation, and we are not going to present it as one, but we noted the shift. That is the honest data picture at 6 months. Modest, real, consistent improvement in functional joint comfort. Stable on a protocol that has shown no adverse effects and has been monitored throughout by a licensed veterinarian. 8 months in, we want to talk about what it actually takes to sustain something like this over time. Because the gap between starting a protocol and maintaining it is where most interventions fail, and we think the sustainability question deserves as much attention as the initial design. The practical reality of Boni's current protocol is straightforward. 3 times per week, his meal includes approximately 30 to 35 grams of canned sardines in water. Daily, his meal includes a half teaspoon of freeze-dried green-lipped mussel powder stirred into his food. Daily, his meal is topped with approximately 60 milliliters of homemade bone broth that we prepare in batches every 10 to 14 days and store refrigerated in glass containers. His base diet remains a premium commercial food that meets AAFCO nutritional standards for adult maintenance. The time investment is real but modest. The sardines require opening a can and measuring a portion. The mussel powder requires measuring half a teaspoon. The bone broth requires a batch preparation session of about 20 minutes of active work followed by an 18-hour low simmer, which we typically set up on a Sunday evening. Per week, the active time involved in Boni's protocol beyond normal feeding is probably 15 to 20 minutes. The financial cost is also real. Quality sardines, mussel powder from a reputable supplier with third-party testing, and the bones for broth preparation add a meaningful but not prohibitive amount to the monthly cost of his care. We are not going to quote specific prices because they vary by location and supplier, and will have changed by the time most people watch this. What we will say is that it is less than the cost of a single veterinary appointment per month, and we consider that a reasonable frame of reference. We have had 2 conversations with our vet since the 6-month assessment about potential protocol adjustments. And we want to describe both because they illustrate something important about how a protocol like this should evolve rather than remain static. The first conversation was about the sardine frequency. Boni's coat and skin condition had been consistently good throughout the protocol, and our vet noted at one point that his omega-3 intake might be slightly above the level necessary for the anti-inflammatory effect we were targeting, particularly as his weight had stabilized and his caloric needs had adjusted slightly. She recommended a modest reduction to twice per week rather than 3 times, monitoring for any change in his observed comfort and adjusting back if needed. We made this change in December 2025 and have not observed any deterioration in his functional mobility over the 6 weeks since. This kind of adjustment, reducing a supplement that had been working when there was reason to believe the current dose was higher than necessary, is something that raw feeding and natural health content rarely discusses. Because the implicit narrative in that space tends to be that more is better. Our vet's perspective, which we have come to share, is that the goal is the minimum effective intervention, not the maximum tolerable one. Every compound we give Boni has a dose-response profile and a potential for adverse effects at higher doses, even if those doses are well above what we are using. Keeping doses calibrated to what is actually needed rather than what might additionally help is both safer and more sustainable. The second conversation was about whether to consider a gradual transition to a more complete whole food diet, formulated by a veterinary nutritionist, rather than continuing the addition to commercial food approach indefinitely. This is an ongoing conversation rather than a resolved one. Our vet's position is that if we want to pursue this, we should work with a board-certified veterinary nutritionist, specifically a diplomate of the American College of Veterinary Nutrition, to formulate a diet that demonstrably meets Boni's complete nutritional requirements, rather than adapting a recipe we found online or in a book. She is supportive of the concept in principle but firm on the formulation requirement. We are currently considering whether this is a direction we want to pursue, and if we do, we will document that process as a separate project. We raise this because we want to be honest about what this protocol is and is not. It is a targeted supplement addition to a nutritionally complete commercial diet, designed and monitored by a veterinarian. It is not a complete raw diet, not a replacement for commercial nutrition, and not a template that scales automatically to a more ambitious dietary overhaul. Those are different projects with different requirements and different risk profiles. Now we want to address something directly that we know will come up, because it comes up in the comments of every video in this space. Some of you will have done more extensive dietary changes with your dogs, full raw transitions, homemade diets, prey model feeding, and you will have had positive experiences. We are not disputing your experience. We are also not in a position to evaluate it, because individual anecdote, including our own, is not a reliable guide to what will work for a different dog with a different health history in a different set of circumstances. What we can tell you is that the research consistently showing nutritional deficiencies in home-prepared dog diets is not aimed at raw feeding communities specifically. It reflects a genuine technical challenge in formulating a complete diet from whole ingredients without professional nutritional analysis. That challenge does not go away because the ingredients are high quality or because the approach feels more natural. We also want to address the question of commercial joint supplements, because some of you will reasonably ask why we went through the process of sourcing whole food ingredients, when there are commercial joint supplement products that contain omega-3s, green-lipped mussel, and other relevant compounds in a convenient combined format. It is a fair question, and our answer is not that commercial supplements are inferior. Some of them are well-formulated and well-tested. Our vet has no blanket objection to them. Our reasons for the approach we took were specific to our situation. We wanted to control the sourcing and form of each component individually rather than accepting the formulation decisions of a supplement manufacturer. We wanted the ability to adjust each component independently based on Boni's response and our vet's guidance. And, frankly, we were already filming a video about it, which created an incentive to do the detailed version rather than the convenient one. If a high-quality commercial joint supplement, reviewed and approved by your veterinarian, is what works for your situation, that is a completely legitimate choice. The compounds matter more than the format, assuming the format delivers them with bioavailability. What we know at 8 months, stated as plainly as we can. Boni is more comfortable than he was when we started. The objective measurements support this modestly and consistently. The protocol has produced no adverse effects detectable through clinical assessment or blood work. The improvements appear to reflect better management of the symptomatic experience of his existing joint disease rather than any structural reversal of it. His underlying anatomy has not changed. His day-to-day functional mobility has. What we do not know whether the omega-3s, the muscle powder, the broth, or some combination of the three, is primarily responsible for the improvements we observed. Whether the weight loss was a more significant factor than any of the additions. Whether the improvements will be sustained long-term or will plateau and require adjustment. Whether any of this will be relevant to your dog. Those unknowns are real. We would rather name them than paper over them. We filmed Boni this morning before we started setting up for the day. It was just past 6, January light, low and gold the way Sacramento winter mornings sometimes get. He walked out the back door and went down the 2 steps into the yard without pausing. Not every morning looks like this. There are mornings, particularly after cold nights or days of more vigorous activity, where the old hesitation is still there, shorter than it was, but present. We note it when it happens. We film it. We bring it to our vet's attention if it persists. That is what managing a dog with early joint disease actually looks like. It is not a cure. It is attention, consistency, and a willingness to keep asking whether what you are doing is working, and to adjust when the answer is unclear. We started this video with a 4-second clip of a dog hesitating on a step. We want to end it by being honest about what that clip represents and what it does not. It does not represent a crisis that a dietary protocol solved. It represents the beginning of a monitoring and management process that is ongoing, that involves a veterinarian as an actual participant rather than a liability disclaimer. And that has, so far, produced a modest and consistent improvement in the daily quality of life of a dog we love very much. That is the accurate version of what happened. We are aware that the accurate version is less compelling than the version where a kitchen experiment reverses a dog's joint disease and everything changes in 90 days. We made that version of this video first, actually. We wrote it, reviewed it, fact-checked it, and realized it was not honest. So we started over. This version is slower. It has more qualifications. It does not have a dramatic clinical transformation at the end. What it has is a real dog. A real process, real data that means what it says. And nothing more, and a real ongoing question about how to best support an animal through a condition that is not going away. We think that is actually more useful than the other version, even if it is less satisfying to watch. If you are at the beginning of this with your own dog, the thing we would most want you to take from this video is not the sardines or the muscle powder or the bone broth. It is the baseline assessment. Get the objective starting point before you change anything. Without it, you are navigating without coordinates, and the emotional pull towards seeing improvement in an animal you love will fill the data gap with something that feels true but is not verifiable. Call your vet, get the baseline, then decide what to try. Then monitor it properly. Everything else is detail. Boni is in the yard right now, doing what Labradors do on January mornings, nose to the ground. Working his way along the fence line with the methodical, absorbed focus of an animal who is, by every indication available to us, comfortable enough in his body to be fully present in it. That is what we were working toward. That is where we are.